take heed, feed your ego, making me blind when your eyes close, sink when you get close, tie me to the bedpost. I alone am the one you don't know you need, you don't know you need me, make me blind when your eyes close, tie me to the bedpost. Who won't swallow my pride? I would choke on the ride.
It's a real honor to have a distinguished panel to present to you this afternoon. My name is Kent Propst. I'm the Assistant to the President for Community Relations at NIC. Your panelists today are giants in America, each for very different reasons, and I think you're going to thoroughly enjoy their presentations. Please, as the program develops, be sure and think up some questions. We will go into a question and answer period at the conclusion of each of their individual presentations. And at this point, I would like to introduce your panelists this afternoon. First of all, Hedy Greene, as portrayed by Kathy Hostetter. She was described as a mean-spirited, tight-fisted, shrewd woman, and she is listed in the Guinness Book of World Records, mind you, as the greatest of misers. At a fairly young age, she inherited millions of dollars from her family. Her philosophy is a very simple one: buy cheap and sell dear. And she has an instinct for knowing which is which. Elizabeth Jane Cochran, better known as Nellie Bly, is portrayed by Annie McKinley. She revolutionized journalism for women. Her pen name, again, is Nellie Bly. She gained world fame when she beat Jules Verne's fictional character Phileas Fogg by traveling around the world in less than 80 days. She beat that record by more than a week. Nellie Bly started her career as a journalist in Pittsburgh when she wrote a letter to the editor. The editor was so captivated by her letter that he asked her to come in, and she got a job working for the Pittsburgh Dispatch. She has gained a reputation and renown for tackling social issues in her columns on working women, reform of divorce laws, and factory conditions. And your final panelist is Dolores Huerta, portrayed by Virginia Hickman. She was born in Dawson, New Mexico in 1930, about 7 months after the famous stock market crash. It was the strength, independence, and ambition of her mother that encouraged Dolores to create her own life and her own sense of purpose. Her passion for justice and equal opportunity makes her one of the century's most powerful and respected labor movement leaders. Those are your panelists this afternoon, and I would like to begin by asking Hedy Greene to come forward.
I hate people that brag about their things from being rich, and I don't like people who brag about their titles. I can remember one time a man was chased by a cow on my property. He was mad. He came to my door to complain. I don't apologize to anybody for anything, by the way. And so I didn't apologize to him. So what did he do? He started throwing his titles at me, how important he was. So what did I do? I said, go tell the cow. And I shut the door in his face. Okay, just so you know that there's certain people that I don't like. What I would like to do this morning is for you to look down at your feet for a second. And just talk to yourself. When was the last time you washed the bottom 4 inches of your skirt? Or washed the bottom 4 inches of your pants? I do that. Why would you waste water washing parts of your clothes that aren't dirty? The only part of my skirt that gets dirty is the part that goes through the mud when I walk across the street. How many of you eat oatmeal? That seems to be a really healthy breakfast. You probably put it on the stove, light the stove, get it hot. You're wasting energy. Why not just put it on the radiator? That's what I do. And you might think I'm a little bit frugal. Some people call me a miser. Some people call me the witch of Wall Street because I wear black and I don't buy new clothes. But to date, I have almost $100 million from some of these non-traditional ways of living. I want to tell you my story, and after I tell you my story, I want you to think whether you think I'm a miser, I'm a witch. And my story begins today with a whale and my grandfather. The whale is called a sperm whale, and the reason it's a sperm whale is it was the whale that started the oil fortune in the New England states. It was a prize whale because in the head of the whale there was 500 pounds of oil, and when you touched it to air, it felt like seminal fluid, so they called the whale the sperm whale. My grandfather started a whaling business, and that started my family fortune. He had 2 daughters, Abby, who was my mother, and Sylvia, who was my aunt. My mother married Edward Robinson, and my grandfather was thrilled because a man can manage money, women can't. And so my father managed both my mother's inheritance and Sylvia's. Sylvia had a disease, and she probably would never be able to manage the account, so he did both. He got out of the whaling business right before it went under and got into real estate, bonds, railroad was going good, and he started making a lot of money. When my mother and father passed away, my father set up for me an inheritance. But going with the era, women don't manage money. So what did he do? He put it into a trust fund. Isn't it funny that they call it a trust fund? Trust fund is when you don't trust somebody to spend your money. So I had a trust fund where I could get a monthly income, and I had a little bit of cash at the time and a house as kind of a token. So I had to find more creative ways to make money. My Aunt Sylvia, I wanted her inheritance too, but she was getting too friendly with her housekeeper, and I was afraid that I would lose the inheritance. So I went to her and convinced her to set up the will so I would get the will. A couple years later, when she died, I found out instead of getting $2 million, I was only going to get $65,000. Somebody had done some forgery. It went to court, and I lost. So you can see a pattern here. I'm not getting all the money that I am supposed to be able to control because I'm a woman. I married, I had 2 children. Ned, my son, had a little accident sledding. Now, as frugal as I am, and you heard me say I don't like reporters and doctors, do you think that I would get him the medical attention that he needed? No, because it was better to go to free clinics. Not only was it better to go to free clinics, I actually got some of the doctors to feel so sorry for me because I look like I can't afford anything the way I dress, that he invited me to his house for private medical care until somebody recognized me. This went on for years. I just went to another free clinic. Eventually, my son lost his leg, and we had to get him a cork leg. And I didn't apologize. I don't ever apologize. My daughter was raised, and she was my house companion. Ned went off to run Some of my investments by then were railroad, bonds, real estate, and so I sent him to Texas to run the railroad, because someday, being the male of the family, he would be in control. Well, gee whiz, he had his own life down in Texas. I was still in the New England states, and he hired this housekeeper. Well, a few years later, I found out the housekeeper was a prostitute. Not just a prostitute, but somebody he hired when he was younger, and she's living with him now, and he's spending the money, he's getting into politics, he's doing car racing, building resorts for fishing, and so forth, which is not what I would be spending my money on. So we had a little bit of difference of opinion on how to spend money there. Later, my husband and I had an agreement. I would spend my money and he would spend his. We both had our money in the same bank. Economy started to fall, and unbeknownst to me, he started going into debt. The bank was going into debt. They were going to close. I went down there to pull my money out and found out my husband was the biggest debtor that bank had, and I was the biggest contributor that bank had, and they wouldn't give me my money because of my husband, even though it was a different account. I lost some money there because in order for me to get my money, I had to pay off his debts. Well, needless to say, what would you do? My husband and I no longer cohabited as husband and wife, although I never divorced him. So, life goes on. I went back to my frugal self. This would be typical. I would live in the flats or apartments while the rich people lived on Fifth Avenue. Maybe you would decorate your house with a dozen red roses. Why would you do that? Roses only live a couple days. They're so expensive. I tell you what I did. My mantle was covered with red roses made out of chicken feathers, and it lasts forever. And heating the house, well, if you got a big room, I just put up petitions, so I only had to heat a little part of the room. Why waste that heat? My whole life was frugal. I just would not pay for anything that was full price. My father, before he died, had sent me almost a couple $1,000s to buy a new wardrobe. I don't know why everybody thinks I need a new wardrobe. I spent $200 of it and reinvested the rest. The bonds were paying off. I got good interest. I would buy more. Pretty soon, big places were coming to me to borrow money. New York City was going into financial debt. They had to lay off police officers. I helped New York City get out of debt. I helped Arizona get their water. I needed to start spending some of my money. I contributed to different things. Little kids, they come to your door, what do? Give them candy? No, not me. I'd give them a piggy bank with $1 in it. They go home, if they still had that $1 and contributed more, I'd give them another $1 for their piggy bank. We're raising our kids thinking that they need presents. What they need is money. They need to learn to invest and have finances. I am getting to be an older woman now. My ways haven't changed. I still only wash the last 4 inches of my skirt. I heat my oatmeal over the radiator. I carry a gun because Aunt Sylvia only gave me a little bit of the will and said that when I die, all the other relatives will get it. So all my other relatives want me to die. I carry a gun now. I carry a gun. Yeah. And my kids, they're in my will. They'll get my inheritance. The problem is they don't have children. All these years of being frugal and saving away, I'm worth almost $100 million, and I have no grandchildren. That makes you want to really reflect. on what's important in your life. And that is my story. You determine which or contributor. Thank you.
Thank you, Hedy. Our next speaker is Nellie Bly.
Thank you. I was the first woman investigative reporter. I was called a daredevil reporter, and some people called me a stunt reporter. But as a good reporter, I know that people like you want to know a background on someone. You want to know where they came from so you can understand why they do what they do. I was born, like Ken said, as Elizabeth Cochran. And I was born in Cochrane Mills, Pennsylvania in 1864. Now I bet you think, isn't that a coincidence? She was born in the same city that her last name is. No coincidence at all. My father was a judge in the town. He was a judge, he was a businessman, he was a wealthy landowner, and they named the town after him. Well, my father also either loved sex or he loved children, one of the two, because he had 15 of us. He had 10 by his first wife and 5 by my mother. Unfortunately, when I was a young girl, around the age of 13, my father died. And in those days, even though my father was a businessman, you would have think he would have figured this out, he didn't leave a will. So all of his, what we thought, all of his money or whatever, it bypassed my mother and it went directly to his children. But what happened was he wasn't as wealthy as we thought, and the only thing he had was the mansion that we lived in, and they sold that, and the money was given to a judge to be distributed out to my mother. Well, my mother, and about 6 of us were still at home at the time, and the judge would give her so much every month to support us, and it wasn't very much. And so my mother at that time had to remarry to support her children. She married a man that when he was sober, he was cross, and when he was drunk, he was cross. And let me tell you, he was drunk more time than he was sober. So eventually, he was very abusive to my mother, and eventually my mother divorced him. And you think about this, back in the 1880s, getting a divorce, I had to go to the court and testify. I had to testify and tell that judge names that my mother was called, names that I would not say in front of this audience today, as distinguished as you. I wouldn't repeat those names. So I realized that I would have to help support the family. At 15, I decided to go to Indiana Normal School and become a teacher. At that time, you could become a teacher if you went to college for 2 years. So I went to the judge and I said, well, is there money for me to go to school? And he assured me that there was. So I went to school, and after the first semester, I came home, and I asked the judge for the tuition and the room and board for my next semester, and he told me there was no money left. The judge had spent all of my father's money. So we went to Pittsburgh, my mother and I and some of our siblings. We went to Pittsburgh, and I worked as a nanny, and my mother worked as a housekeeper. And one day, I was reading the Pittsburgh Dispatch. And the editorial in the Dispatch, the person wrote, "Women belong in the home doing domestic tasks, such as sewing, cooking, and raising children. Working women are a monstrosity." I was very angry. I saw these working women every day. I knew that they weren't working just to have the finer things in life. They were working to put food on their table, a roof over their head. So I wrote a very angry letter back to the editor, letting him know my thoughts, and I signed it, "Little Orphan Girl." The letter was never published, but 2 days later, in the paper, the editor wrote, Well, the gentleman who wrote the letter to the Pittsburgh Dispatch criticizing our editorial piece called "What Are Girls Good For?" please send his name and address to the editor. Mr. Madden wishes to discuss the unknown contributor, the possibility of writing a feature on this same subject for the paper. So I went to see Mr. Madden. At that time, my nickname was Pink, because I dressed in pink all the time. I went to see Mr. Madden and told him that I wrote the article, I wrote the letter. He was so surprised, but he gave me a job, and I became one of the first women reporters to the tune of $5 a week. Now, at that time, too, women were not supposed to write under their God-given name. So we needed to have a pen name for me, and there was a song going through the editor's mind at that time, and thus I became known as Nellie Bly. And that's how I lived the rest of my years, as known as Nellie Bly. Well, I reported on divorce laws. I reported on women prisoners. I reported on how the women were being treated in the factories. And I reported on many things that were of importance to me, thinking of my own mother's time. And pretty soon the factory owners didn't really care for what I was writing, and they threatened to remove their advertising dollar from the Dispatch if I continued to write the kind of stories I was exposing them. Well, the editor didn't want to see his money go, and so then he started sending me off to write about fashion shows and flower shows, and you can imagine how boring that was. So I convinced the editor to send me to Mexico. So my mother and I took off to Mexico, and we started writing. I wrote about the conditions of the women and children in Mexico, and I would send those stories back to the Dispatch, and they would print them. And after about 6 months, the Mexican government got wind of my stories, and they politely escorted me to the border and back into the United States, and was told not to return to Mexico. So I came back to Pittsburgh and wrote about flower shows and fashion shows. And one day, I'd had enough, so I just left this note on my editor's desk. I said, "Dear QO, I'm off to New York. Watch for me, Nellie Bly," and left the newspaper. So I went to New York, and I did a lot of freelance, and finally one day I went to the New York World and applied, and the New York World was owned and operated by Joseph Pulitzer, the Pulitzer Prize, many of you might know. He'll be with us later on this week if you'd like to ask him a few questions about me. And he gave me a job as a reporter. And I did a lot of investigating reporter, did a lot of undercover reporting for him. I posed as an unwed mother to talk about how the babies in New York City were sold on the black market. But my most famous was I posed as an insane person to get into Blackwell Island to expose the asylum and what people were happening in the asylum. So my newspaper put in a story about this Cuban woman that was found walking around the streets of New York City. And eventually I was taken to Blackwell Island, where they declared that I was insane. I came in, I told the doctor I was not insane, and after 10 minutes of talking to me, he decided I was insane. So I was put into the asylum. And what I learned very quickly was it's a lot easier to get into an asylum than it is to get out. The asylum, many people were there that didn't speak English. Many immigrants were there because this was the theory, the asylum's theory. If you couldn't speak English, you must be crazy. So therefore, we'll put you in an asylum. There was a woman in the asylum that her husband, she was having an affair. Her husband found out about the affair and dropped her off at the asylum, said she must be crazy if she would have had an affair. So she was there. Now, at the asylum, we were made to sit on benches when we weren't working. We also did the cleaning and everything, but we were sit on benches for the rest of the day and just stared at the wall. So if you weren't crazy when you came in, you were crazy pretty soon. And the doctors walked through every day and said good morning to us and declared we were still insane, and so we stay there. We were given 5 prunes for dinner and bread with rancid butter. We were given cold showers. They just lined us up and gave us cold showers, and 10 to 12 people would share the same towel. And every day I would tell them I was sane, and every day they would tell me I was insane. Fortunately, after 10 days in the asylum, the lawyer from the paper came and got me out. And then I wrote about that. In fact, I wrote a book about it, and I also wrote many articles about it. And of course, Blackwell Island declared that anything I said was untrue. But now papers were starting to fall in sales. And no matter what we did, we needed to have something that happened to get the paper sales up. We even had to drop our paper sales. The price was 25 cents an issue down to 15 cents. Can you imagine? So we had to drop our paper sales, but they needed a story. So my editors came up with this idea that someone should go around the world in 80 days. Around the world in 80 days. Many of you probably are familiar with this, Jules Verne's book, Around the World in 80 Days. But they just didn't want me to go around the world in 80 days. They thought I should break that record and go around the world in 75 days. So they had a very aggressive plan. You think about it. They had a plan for me to go around. They wrote up this very definite little itinerary for me. But think about it. In 1889, a woman traveling alone was unheard of. A woman traveling around the world was even more unheard of. And they put this goal of 75 days. Let's see, 28,000 miles I would go in 75 days and 4 hours. Now, my theory in life is energy rightly directed, you can accomplish anything. Now, I'm going to ask Hedy here to come and help me hold this map. Hedy, this isn't going to cost you anything. Interest. Should probably charge a user fee. Okay. Take that. Now, let me tell you what we did here. Thank you, Hedy. We started out here in New Jersey, and then I took a boat over here to London. And in London, they decided then that I should go down from London, and I'd take a train down to France to meet the author of this book. Jules Verne was a French author, and so I went down and I spent some time with Mr. Verne and his wife. One of the things he asked me right away was why I skipped Bombay, and if you're familiar with the book, you know, Phileas Fogg, the fictitious person that goes around the world, he goes to Bombay, but I had to save some time, so I had to skip Bombay. From France, I continued down here to Italy, and in Italy, and what I would do is I would always send stories back to the newspaper. I would cable my stories back. The newspaper also made the most of this. On days that I wouldn't have a story, or sometimes I wouldn't have a story, the newspaper would run stories about where I was going, what the countries were like. They also ran a contest, and the contest had that if you could guess my time of arrival, that you would win a free trip to Europe. Can you imagine that? So they had this contest going, and so everybody was reading, everybody was following Nellie Bly, and they were all very excited. Well, in Italy, I went to cable my story back, and I went into the cable office, and I said I wanted this telegraph to New York City. And you know what the man said? What country is New York City in? Now think about it. Back in 1889, very few people knew a lot about New York City. I found as I went around, people thought that America was a big island with lots of houses on it. They thought that there were certain places that they thought we were very backward. Of course, you can imagine many of the boats I was on, there's a lot of English people. I mean, how many times can you hear God Save the Queen and not throw up, you know? So anyway, in a lot of places I went, they wouldn't even take American money. They'd never seen American money before, and they wouldn't take American money. So from Italy, and by the way, I almost missed my boat that day because I finally convinced this man where New York City was. And from Italy, I went on a boat, and I went down here to Port Said, Egypt. Then I went through the Suez Canal. And from there, I went over here to, let's see where I lost myself. Oh, here we go. Well, I went to Sri Lanka. Actually, it was known as Ceylon at that time, but I understand you know it as Sri Lanka today. And I went to Sri Lanka, and then eventually I went over here to Singapore. And in Singapore, I bought a monkey. So Mr. McGivey was his name, and he traveled with me throughout the rest of my trip. On one boat I was on, they threatened to throw Mr. McGivey off board. They claimed he was bad luck. I claimed it was because he bit him. But Mr. McGivey traveled with me, and then from Singapore, let's see, we went up to Hong Kong. Hong Kong was fascinating. All these countries were fascinating. We went up to Hong Kong, and in Hong Kong, I went to the leper colonies. I went to the temples where women went to pray, hoping that they would have a male baby instead of a female baby to take care of them in their old age. And the other interesting thing in Hong Kong, it was under Chinese rule at that time, was they liked to behead people. They beheaded a lot of people. And you could, if you were a wealthy person, like Hedy here, she wouldn't have been beheaded because she could have paid somebody else to be beheaded for her. So if you were wealthy and you went under a crime that was you were going to be beheaded, then you just like went to some family and found a member of that family and bought that person, and they were beheaded for you. So again, always writing for the underdog. And from Singapore, I eventually went to Japan. And actually in Singapore, when I was sending in one of my stories, or in Hong Kong, I was sending in one of my stories, and I went to the telegraph office, and I was going to send in the story, and the telegraph officer said, well, your competition is ahead of you by 3 days. Phileas Fogg? Phileas Fogg's ahead of me by 3 days? That's impossible. He's a fictitious character. Well, that's when I found out this woman by the name of Elizabeth Biss Lane was also going around the world trying to beat me. She was sent out by the Cosmopolitan. The Cosmopolitan isn't the same Cosmopolitan as you know of today. Cosmopolitan at that time was a newspaper. And she was being paid by the newspaper, the Cosmopolitan, to go around the world, and now I find out she's ahead of me by 3 days. So not only do I have to beat Phileas Fogg, now I've got to beat this Biss Lane woman. Then I found out that she was given really unlimited money, and she could bribe ships to go out ahead of schedule. Well, actually, when I left Japan, our ship was delayed by 5 days. So now I was really in a tizzy. So from Japan, though, we went to San Francisco. And that took about 14 days. We ran into lots of horrible weather and stuff, and we actually thought we were not going to make it, but we did, and we actually came in ahead of schedule. Hey, you can go ahead and sit down. Thank you so much for holding that for me. So we actually made it ahead of schedule, but when you know, we get there, and we're just about 1 day from the port, and they say, we left your health papers in Japan. So we're going to have to wait 2 weeks for the health papers to come in. I was outraged. Well, then they found the health papers, and then they decided that the boat was going to be quarantined. I thought, this is impossible. Here I've gone all the way around the world, and I'm going to be stuck in the bay in San Francisco. I decided that my monkey and I would just jump in a rowboat and just go into shore. Well, fortunately, we weren't quarantined. Unfortunately, there was a train waiting for me to take me across the country. And as we went across the country, we ran into a snowstorm, and we ran into lots of awful weather, and Mr. Propst had realized that I was going to need some help here, so he sent out a special train with just one car for me. So we think about it, an engine, just one train, one car that zipped me across the country, and everywhere I stopped, they cheered. They were so excited to see Nellie Bly. And then eventually I landed back in New Jersey, and I completed my trip in 75 days? Is there any other guesses? 72 days. 72 days and 6 hours and 11 minutes. In fact, one person guessed the time within 1 second and got that trip to Europe. 1,500 other people guessed my time within 15 seconds. So, around the world I went, and I wrote that story, and I wrote that book. And now I realize, too, that it was difficult to go around the world in 72 days, but it is even more difficult to tell your life story in 15 minutes. So, I was a writer, not a speaker. And this will give my words of advice to you today, because I think I've told you enough about myself. And to be successful, always know yourself, but never let the world know too much about you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nellie. And our next panelist is Dolores Huerta.
Buenas tardes, damas y caballeros. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like you all to repeat a couple of words in Spanish with me, okay? I'll say the words first and then you repeat them after me. Sí se puede. Sí se puede. Very good. Let's try that one more time. Sí se puede. Sí se puede. Very, very good. Muy bien. Those words in English mean yes, it is possible, or yes, it can be done. And this has been the motto of the United Farm Workers of America. You could also say that it's been my motto through my life. And who am I? I am Dolores Huerta. I was born Dolores Fernandez, April 10th, 1930, in the little town of Dawson, New Mexico. It's just a ghost town now, up in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. And my parents divorced when I was very young, and my mother took my two brothers and me to Stockton, California. Stockton, California is in the San Joaquin Valley, and that's an area that's really well known. It's a very agriculturally rich area. There's farms all around, and it's known for its fruits and vegetables. And this was the first time then in Stockton that I came in contact with the farm workers. You see, my mother ran a small hotel, and the farm workers used to come to the hotel, and they would ask for a place to stay. And a lot of times they didn't have any money. They had no way of paying for their shelter. Sometimes they would offer to pay with the rejected fruits and vegetables that the farmers had allowed them to pick out of the fields. Well, my mother never turned anyone away, and she always had a lot of compassion and generosity. So she would always let the farm workers stay for free because she knew that they were very, very poor. I grew up there in Stockton, California, and I went to the local community college and graduated in 1955 with a teaching certificate. And I got a teaching job. How many of you are teachers? I thought there would be some teachers here today. Well, I was going to be a teacher. But when I started teaching, I had a problem. You see, I couldn't stand seeing the farm worker children coming to school hungry and needing shoes. And I thought, I can do more for the farm workers by organizing them than by trying to teach their hungry children. So I quit my teaching job. And I gave up along with that my steady paycheck. And I went to work for the CSO. That was the Community Service Organization. Now that was kind of a self-help organization, and it provided community services such as free English classes and tutoring services for people who were studying to take their citizenship exams, and also voter registration drives. Voter registration drives. Do you know what is the most important day of your life? It's not your birthday. It's election day. Because that's the day you go to the polls and you choose the people who are going to represent you in your government. Well, I started organizing for the CSO, and I really enjoyed that. And soon I founded the Stockton chapter of the CSO. And then I became their main lobbyist in Sacramento at the state capitol. Now, at the time, I was married to Ventura Huerta, and I was having a baby about every year. And I got a lot of criticism. You know what people said? Why do you want to organize? Why don't you stay home? Look, you're a mother now, you have lots of little children, you should stay at home and be a mom. But I just couldn't do that. So what I did was I convinced my husband to quit his job and start working for the CSO full-time like me. And then I kind of went underground. Okay? I worked behind the scenes, and my husband was the spokesman that everyone saw. It just worked better that way. Well, it was still very difficult, though, because you see, I was gone a lot. I was gone from home a lot. I was lobbying, I was organizing, and so as a result, I missed an awful lot of my children's lives as they were growing up. I missed opportunities to take them to the park or go to church with them. I missed those special little events that they had at school. And I sometimes even missed their birthdays. And I felt bad about that. It was a sacrifice on my part, but it was a greater sacrifice on their part. There was another problem too. We didn't have much money. You see, my husband and I were working for the CSO for food and shelter and $5 a week. Now, when you have a family of 7 children, $5 a week doesn't go very far. And so my husband said, after a while, "Estoy harto," I'm fed up, and he filed for a divorce. I was in San Francisco lobbying for the CSO at the time, and I thought, what am I going to do now? Should I stop fighting for these bills and start fighting for the custody of my children? Well, I'm Catholic, and so I went to the church and I prayed. And after praying, I decided that what I needed to do was keep believing in these things and keep fighting for these things that I believed in. And somehow my family problems would resolve themselves. And you know what? That's what happened. That's what happened. All 15 of the bills that I was lobbying for passed, and I was awarded custody of all 7 of my children. Remember? Sí se puede. Well, it was during the time that I was working for the CSO that I met Cesar Chavez. You probably know him as Cesar Chavez. Well, it didn't take us long to discover that he and I both had the same passionate goal. We wanted to better the lives of the farm workers. The farm workers at this time were all around us, and they were working in the hot sun 10, 12, 15 hours a day, bent over in the hot sun. And then what did they come home to? Well, they came home to substandard living conditions. They lived in family housing. It was provided by the farmers. And a lot of times it was nothing more than a shack, no indoor running water, no indoor plumbing. And when they were out working in the fields in the hot sun, no breaks. And they didn't have any clean toilet facilities. They didn't have a place to wash their hands. We wanted to improve these conditions. And so we started the National Farm Workers Association. That was in 1962. And in 1965, we went on strike. We started the Delano grape strike. And we were striking because the grape farmers, the grape growers in the Delano area were hiring a lot of Mexicans instead of hiring the local farm workers. And we didn't think this was right. So we started a protest, and we started picket lines. And we were able to convince almost 5,000 people to walk off of their jobs and join us in the protest. Of course, the grape growers didn't like this. And they used to drive their trucks right at us, right down the picket lines. We just had to scramble to get out of the way. And then we were covered in dust from head to toe, breathing in the dust from the trucks. But we didn't give up. Sí se puede. Another thing that the farmers liked to do was they liked to spray us, but they didn't spray us with water. They sprayed us with pesticides. But we didn't give up. Sí se puede. Well, in 1968, we started something else. We started the National Grape Boycott. I was in charge of the East Coast Grape Boycott. And I remember getting off the plane in New York and thinking, how am I going to convince 11 million people to stop buying grapes? Well, I talked to unions, and I talked to student groups, and I talked to community organizations, and I talked to Hispanic associations, and I talked to religious groups. And you know what? The people listened. They quit buying grapes. And pretty soon, a lot of the grocery stores quit stocking grapes. And after a while, the restaurant owners refused to serve grapes. And when the sales of grapes went, brrr, cataplun, then the grape growers finally decided to sit down and negotiate with us. Remember, sí se puede. Well, I was the one that wrote all the contracts, so I was doing a lot of negotiating. And I went from farm to farm to farm, negotiating, writing up a contract, negotiating, writing up a contract. I wrote up 200 three-year contracts. And when it was all done, I collapsed in exhaustion and I had to be hospitalized for a couple of days. But, sí se puede. Well, that was in 1970, and in 1973, those contracts all expired. And unknown to us, and unknown to the farm workers, the grape growers made what we call sweetheart deals. Sweetheart deals, contracts with the Teamsters Union. The Teamsters Union is made up of a lot of truck drivers, and we said, wait, this isn't right. You got no representation, no feedback from the people you say you're representing, which are the farm workers. So we protested and we went on strike again. This time, though, we were dealing with some really tough customers. And in August of '73, the Teamsters Union hired thugs, and the thugs came down to the picket lines with baseball bats and with lead pipes and with chains. And in the violence that ensued, 2 of our picketers were killed, beaten to death. Well, we pulled everyone off of the picket line right away because you see, Cesar and I, from the start of the National Farm Workers Association, which later became the United Farm Workers, from the very start we said, no, we only believe in nonviolent protest. No violencia es nuestra fuerza. Nonviolence is our strength. So we pulled everyone off of the picket lines and we started another consumer boycott. And again, the people listened. And this time, the boycott resulted in the enactment of a new law, the Agricultural Labor Relations Act. That was the first law in the history of the United States that protected farm workers, their right to organize and to negotiate with farmers for higher wages and better working conditions. Remember, sí se puede. Now, I would like to talk to you about something else, and that's pesticides. How many of you know that 11.5 million gallons of pesticides are used in the United States per year? How many of you eat organic fruits and vegetables? You probably do that because you've heard that the residue of the pesticides is left on the fruits and vegetables, and then you know that pesticides have been linked with cancer, with neurological defects, neurological disorders, and with birth defects. Well, how would you like to be a farm worker working out in the fields day in, day out, where they're spraying those pesticides, and you have to reach your hand down through those pesticide-drenched leaves to pick the fruits and the vegetables, and you do this 10 to 12 hours a day with nowhere to wash your hands? It was things like this that I protested. And in the 60s, it was partly due to my efforts that 2 of the most dangerous pesticides, parathiene and DDT. Some of you remember DDT? Yeah. DDT and parathiene were taken completely off of the market. But that left an awful lot of pesticides still on the market, and no safety precautions. No safety precautions for the people who were exposed to these pesticides on a daily basis. Well, it was in 1988 that I was protesting this at a rally in San Francisco. And there was a big, tall policeman, and he said, "You've got to move out of the way." Well, I tried to move out of the way, but I guess I didn't move out of the way fast enough because he hit me full force in the stomach with his nightstick. I had to be rushed to the hospital. And the doctor told me later I nearly bled to death, waiting for medical attention because nobody knew how badly I was hurt in the emergency room. I nearly bled to death. I had 4 fractured ribs and a ruptured spleen. Well, you know what I did after I got out of the hospital? I sued the San Francisco Police Department. And you know what came out of that? The San Francisco police have to follow much stricter rules now in any crowd control situation. Remember, sí se puede. Well, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to make this a little bit short. But just since the new millennium, what have I been doing? Well, in 3 weeks, I'm going to be 76 years old. That's not old, is it? I don't think so. I think that's very young. And I'm still very active. I still help out with the UFW, and I have founded the Dolores Huerta Foundation, which if you'd like to know more about the foundation, I welcome you all to sign into the website, okay? And it's, I've broadened my perspective. I'm still concerned with farm worker issues, but I'm also concerned with women's issues and with educational concerns, because I believe that education is a very important thing. And now I'd just like to leave you with these final thoughts. The next time that you go into a supermarket and you pick out a head of lettuce or a basket of strawberries or maybe a bottle of wine to go with your spaghetti dinner, I want you to think of the men and the women who pick those fruits and vegetables and the grapes that go into that bottle of wine. I want you to think of the farm workers, because they are the legs that you and I stand on. And without legs, we cannot walk. And if you ever have the opportunity, the next time it's election day, the next time you have the opportunity to vote, if you ever have the opportunity to vote for some legislation that can help the farm workers, and if someone says to you, what does it matter? You know, you're just one person. It's just one vote. What can you possibly do to help out the farm workers? I want you to look them straight in the eye and I want you to say, sí, se puede. Gracias.
Thank you, Dolores. Now we'll commence to the question and answer section of our program. Please raise your hand if you have a question for any of our panelists. And I would like you to try to mix this up. Let's not gang up on any one of our panelists. Let's try to spread it around amongst all three. Questions, please.
Hi, this question is for Dolores. I was wondering if you know if the average farm worker gets unemployment benefits.
Give it a test.
Hello? It's on. Okay. Yes, the average farm worker does get unemployment benefits because I lobbied for that in 1974. And unfortunately, however, even though they have the right to unemployment benefits, very few of them ever get the unemployment benefits because they're a very transient group and they don't usually stick around long enough to get the benefits that, of course, is taken out of their payroll check. In California, I also lobbied for disability insurance. And now in California, Oregon, and Washington, in all three of those states, the farm workers are covered by disability insurance. Again, you have to remember something, though. More and more the farm workers are becoming, the greater majority of them are undocumented workers. So even though these things are taken out of their paycheck, very few of them ever get any kind of workman's comp because if they're undocumented, they don't want to come forward. They're a very vulnerable group, and they don't want to be deported, so a lot of times they don't get those benefits. Another thing that's interesting, too, is California, out of those three states, I honestly don't know about Idaho, but out of those three states, California and Oregon and Washington, only California has overtime pay for farm workers, but they have to work over 60 hours a week. Yeah. Thank you.
My question is for Greene. You said that you left your inheritance to your children, and I'm wondering what kind of relationship you would have with them, especially if you let your son get his leg amputated. I mean, yeah.
My relationship with my children, I loved my children. And the lessons that I tried to teach them would make them successful. And, I don't know that if I had taken my son to the hospital or to a doctor that they would be able to fix that as well. So, I was teaching them lessons in finance. My daughter, I had a good relationship with. I protected both of my children from potential disaster love relationships. My son obviously had the prostitute, so he was taken care of. But the daughter, when the newspaper started to publish where we lived or tried to publish where we lived, and that I had a single daughter, I mean, there was hundreds of males that started flocking. We moved constantly, trying to protect her. When she did finally marry, I was glad because he was an older man, and I know that he would probably die before she would. And so nobody would have control of the family estate except for her in that case. We moved not just because of that, though. We also moved because of taxes. I didn't want to pay residential taxes anywhere. We lived in 4 different states, and every time somebody found us, we moved on. I didn't have a driver's license. I used public transportation because I didn't want to pay taxes. Those 4 states, someday when I die, will probably fight over where I really did reside, but thank you.
Yeah, for Nellie Bly. Did you beat the reporter from Cosmopolitan, and did you ever meet her?
The reporter, what was her name? Oh, yeah, Miss Lane. Yeah, Elizabeth. Yeah, Miss Lane never mentioned me in her writing, and I never mentioned her in my writing because there was no need to. And the Miss Lane, actually, I traveled with a suitcase a little smaller than my hat box there, so I traveled very lightly. Miss Lane was kind of, as I understand, traveled a little bit with a few more bags, and she got hung up by the customs officer in Italy when they searched her bags, and she missed the boat that she paid extra to have the boat leave early, and she missed the boat because she got hung up in customs. She came in about 2 days, I understand, behind me, and I think only the editor from the Cosmopolitan even met her when her boat came in.
Hedy Greene, did you ever, during your life, set up any philanthropic things or set up any trusts after you were going to die to do philanthropic work?
Set up trust before I die. Yeah. My will was to my children.
So you never set up any trusts and never did any?
No, all the trusts were set up for me.
No philanthropic things?
No, I'm sorry.
Any donations to good causes or anything?
Oh, toward my later years, I started to be a little more charitable, and I contributed to children's funds, churches. Sometimes I loaned instead of gave, but if I loaned at a really good interest rate. One church, in fact, that I loaned at a good interest rate defaulted. They told me that I would not go to heaven unless I excused the loan altogether. And the only time I didn't feel to be a nice person is when somebody took my power away from me. So they did pay for that loan. And I come from a Quaker background, and with a Quaker background, I learned not to brag about some of the things that I contributed to, so I'll leave it at the ones that I mentioned.
Other questions?
I wonder if you made heaven.
My question is for Dolores. I imagine there must have been a great amount of fear among the workers in these protests, especially because they weren't used to doing this. I just was wondering if getting them organized was easy. Were they ready and willing, or what kind of strategies did you use to combat that fear that they must have had?
Well, yes, there was a lot of fear, and some of them, remembered back when, it was through the Depression, so they didn't want to lose the little bit of money that they had. So it took a lot of convincing, and it took a lot of just grassroots effort mostly. I think that was one thing. Speaking Spanish, I could speak to the farm workers that came from a Mexican-American, culture. And I think that then also Cesar and I were both, my father was a farm worker, and he was a farm worker, and he worked in the fields. Cesar did, and his family was farm worker family. So, you know, we were able to relate really well on a ground level with the people. I think that probably too we were both pretty devoted, and neither Cesar nor I ever took any money other than just what we really, really needed to live off of. The $5 a week was about what stayed, the money that I continued to make for a long time, and I don't have a pension fund. A lot of these things. So I think that it was just a matter of saying, you know, we're with you, and we know, and we're part of you, and you can do this. The whole idea of sí se puede, it is possible, it can be done. That really encouraged people to I think they sort of, once they became united, they felt more of this. They felt more of a strength then, and they could see that it was possible. Things really were possible. At one point, we were up to 100,000 members in the UFW, and now it's gone lower than that. But there's other unions too now, and so maybe that has a little bit to do with that. But yeah.
My question's for Nellie Bly. You said that at the end of your 72-day journey that, you know, the reward in itself of people recognizing you and cheering you as you went across the United States, was there any financial reward for you as a writer considering the minuscule funds they gave you along the way?
Oh, thank you for asking that. It was interesting enough, I did receive a lot of notoriety. I was able to write a book, but the newspaper did not give me a raise, and they just kind of like just treated me like I was just your average reporter just going around, and I didn't work for the newspaper much longer after that because I thought it was a little bit disrespectful that they didn't recognize my work and I endangered my life and helped their sales, and so.
Other questions? Very good. Great questions, great answers, panelists. And now, before we adjourn, I would like to ask each of our panelists to give us an explanation of how you picked your character, what intrigued you, what you found fascinating about your characters. Hedy, let's start with you.
Okay, so I'm out of character now. Well, first of all, I thank you to Mona Klinger. She's the one who brought the character to my attention. I think one of the things that I thought was really interesting, she was the richest woman. She was the richest woman in America. I can talk about her death now that I'm out of character, but when she died, they estimated it to be somewhere between $100 million and could be up to $200 million because there was some records not clear. $100 million in today's time is $1.6 billion. And yet, I've been studying her for about 6 months, and I've only come across 2 people that knew who she was. And so, you know, I look at an individual that has spent their entire life with a passion. Maybe it's money, but that was her passion. And to do without and to be forgotten, in a sense, was kind of amazing to me. I think that she... the money that was left to her kids, a lot of it was spent, but a lot of it was put, to answer the gentleman's question, a lot of it was put to churches, schools. She had libraries. The daughter, in particular, set it up for the libraries, and there was a lot of contributions to society, you know, so...
I chose to do Nellie Bly because I teach the mass media in our society class here, and Nellie Bly always gets about 2 paragraphs in the mass media book. So, and I find her rather interesting, and so I wanted to find out more about her. And I did find out the interesting thing about Nellie Bly is she did almost everything that she's known for before she was like 28, 29 years old. And she was like 25 when she went around the world. And then she eventually got out of reporting and married when she was 30. And she was smart, like Hedy's daughter here. She married a 70-year-old man, so they were only married for 10 years before he died. And then she went on to take over his businesses, and she also made like steel drums in the industry. And she also did other things too, and kind of on your line. She got gyms in her companies had gyms where the people can work out, and she helped getting medical insurance for all of her employees and everything. But also too, it's interesting that I found the most research that I found is that Nellie Bly is really well known from the younger people, because there's tons of books out about her. There was a board game written about her. There was a hat named after her. And actually the children's books make it, and especially when she had the monkey Mr. McGivey. And I was just thinking nowadays when the custom officer confiscates your nail clippers, I was thinking, what would they do with that monkey? I couldn't imagine going through with the monkey. So anyway, so I found her very, very interesting and very inspiring.
Well, I chose Dolores Huerta because I teach Spanish here, so I wanted to do something that would, have to do with the Latino culture, and I couldn't be Cesar Chavez. What was interesting was I had no idea how much she did. I mean, the little bit that I told you was nothing. With those first contracts, she not only did the negotiating and wrote up all the contracts, but she did the hiring halls, and she arranged the ranch, what am I trying to say? The accommodations for different people, and the grievance board. She took care of all the grievance boards and the arbitrations, and I mean, she just did all kinds of things, and I don't think that anybody realizes this. Matter of fact, I had a hard time finding a book just on Dolores Huerta. The only one I found is a children's book. And I was just so impressed with her total devotion, her whole entire life to working for these people and trying to give them, better opportunities and better working conditions. And when there's they have no money, they have no clout, so it's pretty hard in this day and age, and she's still at it. She was on a march about 2 weeks ago. So she's still very, very devoted to all her causes that she believes in. Matter of fact, I have to do this. I have to be a little bit of the political activist here. There's a bill right now called Ag Jobs, and it was sponsored, or it was negotiated by the agricultural businesses and the UFW as sort of a compromise bill, and it's getting bipartisan support. That means both the Democrats and the Republicans are for it, which in this day and age is not heard of, very often anyway. And so, and what's interesting is the two congressmen who are sponsoring this bill are Ted Kennedy and Idaho's Larry Craig. Yeah, so just wanted to, if you want to find out more about that, you can go to the United Farm Workers website and find out about ag jobs. I think they're voting on it this coming week, maybe. I'm not sure. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. You've been a great audience, and the panelists have been absolutely amazing. Let's have a big round of applause for our panelists.
Sister coming from Jersey Bay, raised from Alabama. Miss Honeycutt Santa